Hot Rod didn't become a leader by seeking power. He became one by stepping forward when everything was already falling apart. And from that moment on, every mistake mattered more than his intentions ever could. I learned that lesson the hard way, when responsibility arrived before I understood who I would need to become. For me, it was the moment I held my daughter for the first time, realizing there was no rehearsal, no return to who I'd been, and no version of the future where this responsibility could be put down. Because there's a kind of leadership where doing your best still isn't enough, where failure doesn't mean you didn't care. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, and this is the story of Rodimus Prime, and the cost of becoming a leader too soon. Before the Matrix, before the burden, before the impossible expectations, there was just Hot Rod. Not a failure, not a symbol, not a cautionary tale, just pure potential, loud, confident, and unfinished. Most leadership stories begin at the moment of transformation. They skip the part where bravado is mistaken for readiness, where the would-be leader believes they're untouchable. To understand why Rodimus struggled, we have to start with who Hot Rod was before the death of Optimus Prime. Before the Matrix ever chose him, Hot Rod already believed he was meant for something bigger. Not because he was arrogant in a cruel way, not even because he wanted power, but because everything about him kept pushing forward. Hot Rod was fast, he was brave, he was optimistic to a fault, and more importantly, he wanted to help. From the moment we meet him, Hot Rod runs toward danger, not away from it. He doesn't wait for orders, he doesn't hesitate. When the Decepticons attack Autobot City, he jumps in. That instinct matters, because Hot Rod isn't reckless out of selfishness, he's reckless out of belief. A belief that things will work out, belief that doing something is always better than doing nothing, belief that if you care enough, the rest will sort itself out. That's not a flaw in isolation, that's the kind of thinking that creates heroes, but it's also the kind of thinking that mistakes confidence for readiness. Hot Rod believes in himself because, up to that point, there's no reason not to. He hasn't been tested in a way that forces humility yet. He's talented, he's capable, and he's surrounded by legends. But this creates a dangerous gap, because when you grow up watching giants like Optimus Prime carry the weight, it's easy to assume you'll figure it out when your turn comes. Hot Rod doesn't see leadership as something you train for. He sees it as something you step into, and that belief feels familiar. When things come easily early in life, effort can feel optional, success feels repeatable, failure feels theoretical. You start to assume that being smart means being prepared, that potential is the same thing as qualification, and any warning signs, they can be brushed away. Hot Rod ignores friction the same way many capable people do, not because he's careless, but because friction hasn't punished him yet. He's impulsive, but it works. He's bold, and it pays off. He breaks protocol, and the outcome usually rewards him. So why would he slow down? Why would he question instincts that have always led him forward? But it's a trap. Confidence doesn't announce when it turns into overreach. It just keeps encouraging you, right up until the cost becomes too great to bear. Hot Rod's goodness is real. His desire to protect others is genuine, but it's unrestrained. He hasn't learned when not to act yet. He hasn't learned that sometimes leadership means waiting, or listening, or letting someone else take the hit. He wants to prove himself, not for praise, but for purpose. And to a young mind, proving yourself feels noble, until responsibility demands more than you can ever imagine. These moments are defining, but they're easy to overlook. But leadership doesn't start at transformation, it starts before, when confidence goes untested, and when someone believes their heart will carry them through anything. Hot Rod isn't a problem waiting to happen. He has potential, but it's shrouded by confidence and inexperience. That's who Hot Rod was before the Matrix. He's not a fool, he's not a failure, he's just a kid. Just someone who hasn't been slowed down by reality yet. And when the reality of war finally arrived, through Unicron's attack and Optimus Prime's death, he didn't have a moment to catch up. Unearned confidence can survive a lot. It can survive warnings, it can survive friction, it can even survive small failures. What it can't survive is catastrophe. Because when the world collapses all at once, there's no space to learn, no time to adjust, no margin for becoming. And Hot Rod never gets that margin, because the moment that tests him doesn't arrive slowly, it arrives all at once, in burning cities, in lost friends, and in the death of the one figure who everyone believed could never fall. The moment that defines Hot Rod's story isn't a test he asked for. When Megatron confronts Optimus Prime, Hot Rod doesn't intervene out of pride. He doesn't step forward to prove himself. He doesn't believe he's replacing anyone. He reaches for the only thing he knows how to do, protect someone who matters. The same instinct that drove him to protect Daniel when the Decepticons attacked. That distinction matters, because quick instinct isn't strategic, but it isn't arrogant either. It's human. Hot Rod sees his leader in danger and does what he's always done. He runs towards the threat, and everything changes. Megatron takes him hostage, Optimus Prime is mortally wounded, and the war doesn't just escalate, it loses its center. The Autobots don't just lose a commander, they lose the figure who made them believe everything would be okay. And Hot Rod loses something too, not just a mentor, not just a hero. He loses the version of himself who believed caring was enough. What makes this moment so devastating isn't just the loss, it's the speed. There's no pause, no margin, no space to catch up. Optimus dies on a cold lab table, and the future of the Autobots is thrown into question. The matrix of leadership recognizes potential, not readiness. And when chaos strips away every safer option, potential becomes inheritance. Leadership doesn't arrive after grief, it arrives during it. Through the collapse of everything familiar, through Unicron's arrival, through Galvatron's rise, Hot Rod survives. He escapes the Quintessons, he endures what should have destroyed him, and in those moments, the potential the Matrix recognized becomes visible. It's not wisdom, it's not mastery, it's resilience. So when the Matrix finally activates in Hot Rod's hands, it isn't a reward, it isn't recognition, it's inheritance. Rodimus Prime isn't born out of triumph, but out of shock. The Matrix doesn't ask if he's ready, it doesn't pause for understanding, it doesn't care that he's still carrying the weight of Optimus Prime's death. It chooses potential, and potential, given too much too quickly, can be dangerous. This is where most interpretations go wrong. They treat this as a coronation, as destiny fulfilled, as the moment Hot Rod should rise and become something else. But that's not what this is. This isn't ascension, it's responsibility landing on someone who hasn't had time to grieve, to doubt, or to question who they are without the people who shape them. Rodimus Prime doesn't step into leadership. Leadership falls on him, and it does so in the middle of the worst possible crisis. There's no training period, no buffer, no grace, just expectation. And expectation carries a silent message. You're in charge now, act like it. That pressure changes how trauma is processed. Grief is replaced with performance, and that's where the guilt takes root. Not because Hot Rod caused Optimus Prime's death, but because he had a part in it. Because when something breaks at the exact moment you step forward, the mind starts connecting dots that logic can't undo. If I hadn't acted, if I had waited, if I were better, the confidence that wants to find him begins to crack. Rodimus doesn't just inherit the Matrix, he inherits a story that comes with it. A story that says, Optimus was perfect, Optimus was prepared, Optimus never hesitated. And standing next to that legend, with the weight of the galaxy watching, Rodimus has no room to be unfinished. The tragedy isn't that he struggles, the tragedy is that he struggles almost immediately, publicly, without permission to learn. Leadership in this moment isn't a calling, it's a sentence. I felt that same shift, when responsibility stops being something you step into and becomes something you can't step away from. I felt that shift the moment we brought home our daughter. One day, I was still learning, still improvising, still allowed to be unfinished, and then suddenly, someone depended on me completely. Not hypothetically, not someday. There was no clocking out, no margin for collapse. The terrifying part wasn't the work. It was realizing that everything has changed. That whatever I was becoming, I had to become it fast. Because someone else was already counting on the result. It's the exact emotion felt by Rodimus as he takes command. And once that sentence is passed, everything Rodimus does will be measured against a standard he never had time to grow into. The Matrix gives him power, but it also takes away something just as important: time. Time to process, time to become, time to fail quietly. From this point on, Rodimus Prime is never allowed to simply be inexperienced. Every doubt becomes weakness, every mistake becomes proof, every hesitation becomes evidence that he never should have been chosen at all. And that's the real cost of him taking on the Matrix. Not that Hot Rod failed, but that he was never allowed to be unfinished. The tragedy of Rodimus Prime isn't what happens in the moment he's chosen, it's what happens after. Because leadership doesn't end when the crisis passes, that's when it begins. And once the fires of Unicron's attack fade, once the galaxy keeps moving forward, Rodimus is left with something far heavier than the Matrix: the question of whether he was ever meant to carry it at all. Rodimus Prime doesn't spend Season 3 failing, he spends it thinking. And for many fans, that distinction got lost. Where Optimus Prime projected certainty, Rodimus projects awareness. He questions decisions, he weighs consequences, he asks whether the Autobots would be safer without him, not because he's weak, but because he understands what leadership demands. Season 3 shows a commander who wins battles, but loses sleep. A leader who can act decisively, yet still asks whether the action was right. That self-interrogation defines Rodimus Prime, and it's also what made him unpopular. Not because he's inherently lesser, but because Optimus represented something rare: certainty, clarity, a belief that the right path would always reveal itself. Rodimus inherits leadership after the illusion is already broken, where Unicron exists, where Galvatron isn't just evil, but persistent. The context matters. Rodimus doesn't doubt himself because he's incapable. He doubts himself because he understands the stakes. Nowhere is that clearer than when he tries to give the Matrix back. It isn't cowardice. It's a responsibility that he's finally taking seriously. Rodimus understands something crucial. Power doesn't automatically grant legitimacy, and leadership doesn't become noble just because it's inherited. He isn't trying to escape duty, he's asking whether holding it is harming the people he's meant to protect. That question alone disqualifies him from recklessness. Because the Autobots don't need reflection, they need reassurance. They need a symbol. And Rodimus knows he isn't one. He sees the statue of Optimus, he hears the stories, he feels the comparison even when no one says it out loud. So every hesitation reads as weakness, every moment of thought becomes doubt, every attempt at care becomes evidence that he isn't Optimus. But that was never the job. Rodimus wasn't chosen to replace Optimus Prime. He was chosen to lead the Autobots in a universe where certainty no longer exists. That's why his leadership feels heavier, because he doesn't have the luxury of legend. He has his reality. Under the Matrix is still the same bot who fished with Daniel, who laughed, who cared. Rodimus leads knowing some decisions will cost lives, knowing not all battles can be won cleanly, knowing hope doesn't always arrive in time. And that awareness shows. He hesitates, not because he fears action, but because he understands the cost of acting wrong. For audiences raised on Optimus Prime, that reads like failure. But for anyone who has ever been responsible for others, and I mean truly responsible, it reads like responsibility arriving too soon. Rodimus Prime isn't haunted because he doubts himself. He's haunted because he understands leadership, and was handed it before he had time to grow into it. That isn't weakness. That's the cost of becoming self-aware before the world allows you to grow up. By the time Rodimus Prime takes command, the damage is already done. Not just to Cybertron, not just to the Autobots, but to the idea that leaders can arise above anything. Because once responsibility arrives through loss, there is no version of leadership untouched by consequence. And that raises a harder question, not about Rodimus himself, but about the conditions we expect leaders to survive. And to understand why Rodimus was crushed by the role, we need to look at a leader who wasn't, one who inherited responsibility but was given something Rodimus never had: time. At first glance, Optimus Primal and Rodimus Prime seem cut from the same cloth. Both are younger successors, both step into leadership during crisis, both carry the weight of legacy, but the difference between them isn't character, it's timing. Optimus Primal becomes a leader in a contained disaster, a small maximal crew, a limited Predacon threat, a war that matters, but doesn't immediately decide the fate of an entire species. Primal makes mistakes early. He hesitates, he misjudges Megatron, he puts his team at risk more than once. And crucially, he survives those mistakes. He's allowed to learn while leading, to listen, to adapt, to grow into the role without the universe watching his every move. There is no statue looming over him, no impossible comparison, no expectation that he replaced a myth. Primal is allowed to become himself, while Rodimus is not. Rodimus inherits leadership in the shadow of a god. Optimus Prime doesn't just die, he becomes a standard frozen in time, perfect, certain, unquestioned. Rodimus steps into command with Cybertron already lost, Unicron threatening reality itself, Galvatron operating from the shadows, and an entire species desperate for reassurance. There is no margin for error, no room to fail small, no space to learn quietly. Every decision Rodimus makes is measured against a leader who never had to lead this version of the war. That's the unfairness at the heart of this story. Primal's leadership is shaped by grace. Rodimus's leadership is shaped by expectation. Grace isn't about lowering standards. Grace is about allowing formation. When Primal hesitates, it's caution. When Rodimus hesitates, it's weakness. When Primal reflects, it's growth. When Rodimus reflects, It's proof he is an Optimus. But that comparison was never reasonable, because Rodimus wasn't chosen to replace Optimus Prime. He was chosen to lead what remained, after certainty was already gone. Primal leads in a story where hope is still forming. Rodimus leads in a story where hope has already been broken. That distinction matters, because leadership under collapse doesn't look heroic. It looks heavy. It looks uncertain. It looks like knowing the cost of being wrong is irreversible. Rodimus doesn't lack confidence. He lacks insulation. Every mistake is final. Every loss compounds. Every hesitation is magnified. And unlike Primal, Rodimus doesn't get to grow into legend. He has to live beneath one. That's why this comparison reframes everything. Primal shows us what leadership can become when time and trust are available. Rodimus shows us what leadership costs when they aren't. Grace didn't make Primal strong, it made him possible, and Rodimus never received that gift. Before we go any further, if you ever stepped into a role you thought you were ready for, only to realize the weight arrived faster than the confidence, if you've ever been trusted with responsibility before you fully understood who you were becoming, then you're not watching this by accident. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, not a show about who hits hardest, not a ranking of victories or power levels, but a place to slow down and examine the characters we grew up admiring, and ask what it actually cost them to lead. Because leadership doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like doubt. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like carrying a burden before you had time to grow strong enough to set it down. Over the course of this year, we're following one question across stories, worlds, and myths. How do we become better men? So if this question matters to you, if you're trying to build a life that doesn't consume you in the process, subscribe. You're not late, you're not behind, and you're right on time. It's easy to keep Rodimus Prime at a distance, to treat his story as something that belongs to animation cells, nostalgia, or a different era of heroes. But the truth is, we didn't grow out of the story, we stepped into it. Because Rodimus Prime isn't just a lesson about leadership and war, he's a warning about what happens when responsibility arrives before identity has time to settle. And that story didn't end in the 1980s, it followed us home. Most men don't fear responsibility, they chase it, they work toward it, they prepare for it, they imagine who they'll become once they finally have it. The fear comes later, after the title, after the expectation, after the quiet realization that everyone assumes you know what you're doing, and you're not sure you do. That's where Hot Rod becomes relatable, whether we like it or not. Because today's Rodimus Prime doesn't wear a matrix, he wears expectations. He's the new father who thought confidence would arrive the moment the baby did. The startup founder who believed passion would carry him through the gaps. The new manager promoted for performance, not wisdom. The creative handed leadership before they ever figured out who they were without the work. On the outside, they look ready. They say the right things, they project certainty, they carry themselves like they belong. But underneath, something quieter is happening. They're performing readiness. Because fake confidence doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from a fear of exposure. From the fear that if you slow down or misstep, someone will realize you're still figuring it out. We live in a culture that celebrates responsibility but punishes the process of growing into it. You wanted this becomes the unspoken rule. You wanted the promotion, you wanted the family, you wanted the business, you wanted the life. So deal with it. No grace, no runway, no space to admit uncertainty without it being mistaken for weakness. That's the same pressure Rodimus lived under. The moment he took command, he wasn't allowed to be learning, he was expected to be Optimus. And most men today aren't afraid of failing outright. They're afraid of being seen mid-formation. I feel this right now. Even talking about these ideas, building this channel, putting my life out there, there's a part of me that worries I'm still becoming the person I'm speaking as. That you'll see the uncertainty before the confidence catches up. It's the fear of being unfinished in public, afraid of letting people see the doubt, the hesitation, the question that comes with real responsibility. Because once you're the provider, the leader, the one people depend on, uncertainty feels dangerous. So you do what Rodimus did. You keep going. You shoulder it. You tell yourself you'll figure it out on the way. And sometimes you do, but sometimes you burn yourself out trying to become that version of yourself everyone expects, instead of the version you actually are. That's where this story connects back to Spawn. Because burnout doesn't happen when you stop caring. It happens when you care so much that you refuse to admit something is costing you more than it's giving. And it connects back to Optimus Primal too. Because Primal learned in motion, he failed quietly, he was allowed to adjust. Rodimus wasn't, and neither are most men today. We're handed responsibility at full speed until maturity will catch up. But maturity doesn't come from pressure, it comes from permission. permission to fail without being erased, permission to question without being replaced, permission to grow without pretending you're already finished. Rodimus Prime isn't relevant because he struggled. He's relevant because he struggled while being watched. And that's the part most men recognize. Not the battlefield, not the Matrix, but the feeling of carrying something heavy while everyone assumes you're strong enough to never let it show. That isn't weakness. That's responsibility arriving before you ever had time to adjust. And that's why this story still matters. Because most of us aren't afraid of the burden. We're afraid of what happens if people see us learning how to carry it. There's a moment in Rodimus Prime's story that never gets animated. It's not a battle, it's not a failure, it's not even a decision. It's the moment after the Matrix chooses him, when the noise fades and he realizes that they're going back to being Hot Rod. No more learning out loud, no more reckless optimism, no more room to be unfinished. From that point on, everything he does matters more than who he is. And that's the part most people never forgave him for, because Rodimus Prime wasn't asked to grow into leadership. He was asked to replace a legend while the universe was already collapsing. So let me ask you something. Where did responsibility arrive in your life before your identity had time to catch up? Where were you promoted, took on roles, grew your family before you actually understood who you were becoming? And what part of you did you have to abandon just to look like you belonged there? For me, that responsibility arrived the day I became a father. I knew the moment was coming, and I thought I'd be ready, but I wasn't, and that no longer mattered. It's the same quiet tragedy faced by Rodimus Prime. Not that he struggled, that he struggled in public. Every doubt became weakness, every pause became evidence, every question became proof that he was an Optimus. But he was never meant to be. Rodimus didn't inherit clarity, he inherited consequence. He led in a world without certainty, with the illusion that the right choice would reveal itself. And that kind of leadership doesn't look heroic. It looks heavy. It looks like hesitation, like reflection, like someone who understands that power doesn't erase the cost of coming into power. Rodimus Prime isn't a warning about failure. He's a warning about what happens when we expect someone to become a leader before they're allowed to become a person. Hot Rod didn't fail because he wasn't enough. He failed because he was thrust into a role he couldn't possibly fill without time to grow into it. And if that feels uncomfortably familiar, you're recognizing yourself in his story. Because adulthood has the way of doing the same thing to us. We step into responsibility before we shed who we thought we were. We carry expectations before we understand our limits. We lead while still forming the self that leadership requires. Rodimus Prime never got grace, but maybe we can learn to give it, to him and to ourselves. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, not a show about perfect leaders, but about the cost of becoming one. If this episode connected with you, I'd really like to hear it. What part of Rodimus' story felt closest to your own? And if you want more stories like this, where we don't just revisit the characters we grew up with, but use them to understand who we're becoming, make sure you're following the show. So stay thoughtful, stay honest, and as always, stay handsome.